Do you know the song? Have you ever heard it before? Many of you, if you were kids growing up on a hot summer's day, you might have heard this song one day as an ice cream truck rolled down the street and you rushed out the house to go get that ice cold ice cream. This is one of the songs that in the U.S. is played by some ice cream trucks. There are about 4 or 5 songs that are traditionally played. There's even one that has been known to have a few racial undertones, specifically racist against African Americans. But this particular song was written by an African American by the name of Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was born in Texas between June 1867 and mid-January 1868. He was the second of 6 children born to a father who was an ex-slave and a mother who was a free-born domestic worker. When he was still a young child, Joplin's family left the farm on which his father worked and moved to Texarkana, which straddles the Texas-Arkansas border. Again, he was the son of a slave and a free-born domestic worker. As a young child, Scott Joplin gained access to a piano in a white-owned home where his mother worked, and he taught himself the rudiments of music. His talent was noticed in Texarkana by a local German-born music teacher who instructed him further by placing special emphasis on European art forms, including opera. The first documented sign of Joplin's musical career is in the summer of 1891 when he began working with a minstrel troupe in Texarkana. In 1893, he was in Chicago at the time of the World's Fair, leading a band and playing the cornet. In 1895, he traveled as far as East Syracuse, New York, with his Texas Medley Quartet. When not traveling, Joplin worked in Sedalia as a pianist, playing at various events and sites, including the town's 2 social clubs for black men, the Maple Leaf, which we'll hear about later, and Black 400. He also taught several of the local young musicians in town. In 1896, he attended music classes at George R. Smith College in Sedalia, but it's believed that even in the late 1890s, he still lacked complete mastery of music notation. Well, this technical deficit did not prevent him from developing as a composer. In 1896, he published 2 marches and a waltz. Late in 1898, he tried to publish his first 2 piano rags, but succeeded in selling only one entitled Original Rags. This publication experience was not satisfactory for him, as he was forced to share credit with a staff arranger whose name was added as arranger and was cited as composer on the copyright and in some newspaper advertisements. In other words, even though he came up with the music, someone else took credit for what he had done. Before Joplin published his next rag, he obtained the assistance and guidance of a young Sedalia lawyer. See, he learned his lessons from the first time. In August 1899, they contracted with Sedalia music store owner and publisher John Start to publish the Maple Leaf Rag, which was to become the greatest and most famous of piano rags. Sales in the first year were slight. There was only about 400. But by 1909, about 500,000 copies had been sold, and that rate was continuous for the next 2 decades. In 1901, he moved to St. Louis with his new wife, Belle. Here he performed a little, preferring to devote his time to composition and teaching. Early in 1903, he filled a copyright application for an opera, A Guest of Honor, which was about Booker T. Washington's dinner at President Roosevelt's White House in 1901. This was an event that polarized the nation, with African Americans taking pride in the event. It was for this reason that Joplin paid tribute to Roosevelt with his piano rag, A Strenuous Life, and attempted to memorialize the event with this opera. A few months later, he formed an opera company with about 30 personnel, rehearsed the work at the Crawford Theater in St. Louis, and then embarked on a tour scheduled to take him to towns in Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. Early in the tour, someone associated with the company stole the box of receipts, seriously damaging the company's financial position. It was a few weeks later in Pittsburgh, Kansas, that the tour ended with Joplin unable to meet his payroll. Furthermore, Unable to pay for the company's board at a theatrical boarding house, all of his possessions, including the music from the opera, were confiscated. Copies of the score were never filed with the Library of Congress, and the music has never been recovered. In June, his marriage with Belle having ended, Joplin returned to Arkansas and married Freddie Alexander in Little Rock. Following the marriage, the couple traveled by train to Sedalia, stopping at towns along the way so that Joplin could give concerts. Tragically, Freddie developed a cold that progressed into pneumonia and died 10 weeks after their marriage. After Freddie's funeral, Joplin left Sedalia and never returned. Through the next few years, his career seems to have floundered, and having lost much of his money on the failed opera, he was in a poor financial condition. He spent most of the time in St. Louis, picking up insignificant playing jobs for little money. In the summer of 1907, Joplin went to New York to make contacts with new publishers and to find financial backing for Trementia, an opera he had been working on for several years. His most significant new publisher became Seminary Music, a firm that shared office space and was closely associated with Ted Snyder Music, a publisher that employed the young Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin is now best known for Alexander's Ragtime Band, What I'll Do, and White Christmas. Between 1907 and 1908, Joplin published 7 songs through Seminary. He published only one rag in 1910, but completed his opera and tried to get it published. He told his friends that he had turned it over to Irving Berlin at Snyder Seminary, but that Berlin rejected it a few months later. However, the following spring, in 1911, Irving Berlin published his greatest hit song up to that time, Alexander's Ragtime Band, and Joplin complained to friends that the song's verse was taken from the marching onward section of A Real Slow Drag in Trementia. For the second time in his career, a song that Joplin worked hard to produce and create and was taken from him and credit given to someone else. Joplin then altered that section and published the opera himself in mid-May 1911. The opera's story relates how Trementia, the only educated member of her community, leads her townspeople out of the bondage of ignorance and superstition. The story is an allegory of how Joplin viewed the problems of the African American community of his time, proposing the view that racial equality would come with education. Joplin gave a copy of the score to the editor of the American Musician and Art Journal, an important music magazine. In the June issue, the magazine published a lengthy review of the score, declaring it to be the most American opera ever composed. Encouraged by this review, Joplin set about to arrange a performance of the opera, but was unsuccessful. Through the next 4 years, he announced several full productions, but none were realized. He never witnessed a completely staged performance of his opera. His efforts to have the opera produced detracted from his other creative work. In 1913, Joplin formed his own publishing company. During the next 3 years, Joplin composed several new rags and songs, a vaudeville act, a musical, a symphony, and a piano concerto, but none of these were published and the manuscripts have been lost. By 1916, Joplin was experiencing the devastating physical and mental effects of syphilis, a disease he had probably contracted about 20 years earlier. By mid-January 1917, he had to be hospitalized and was soon transferred to a mental institution where he died on April 1st, 1917. Scott Joplin was the most sophisticated and tasteful ragtime composer of the era, but he inspired to more. His goal was to be a successful composer for the lyric stage, and he continually worked toward this end. His piano playing was described as mediocre. However, he also played cornet and violin, but put little effort into developing himself on those instruments. He is reported to have had a fine singing voice and performed at times as a singer. He also had perfect pitch, and on becoming proficient at music notation, composed away from the piano. He also had a profound belief in the importance of education. At the time of his death, he was almost forgotten. Interest in ragtime, too, was quickly waning as the new style of jazz took center stage. But Joplin never slipped totally into oblivion. His maple leaf rag continued to exercise its magic on successive generations of musicians and music lovers. In the 1940s, a group of jazz musicians seeking to revitalize their art with the spirit of the past included ragtime in their development of traditional jazz. This inspired a ragtime revival, and though it was slight, it continued to slowly gain adherents. The revival peaked in the 1970s as new recordings of Joplin's music, produced for the first time on classical labels, set classical sales records. At the same time, the notated music became available through reprinted collections, most notable a 2-volume set issued by the New York Public Library, and Tremonition was finally staged, finally reaching Broadway. This quickly growing presence inspired George Royhill to use Joplin's music in his film The Sting, which became immensely popular and brought Joplin to the notice of the mass public. The result was unprecedented in music history. Led by music that Joplin had composed more than half a century earlier, ragtime became a current and universally loved style. Piano recitalists programmed it alongside Chopin mazurkas, dancers stepped to its rhythms in discos, and pop artists played it in stadiums. Recordings of Joplin's music reached the top rungs of the marketing charts for both classical and popular categories. Ragtime was back. In recognition of his significant accomplishments and achievements, the Pulitzer Committee in 1976 issued a posthumous award for Scott Joplin's contribution to American music. So for a man who was born to a father who was a slave, to have come up teaching himself how to play music, to go through the loss of one spouse and the death of another, to have the works that he produced stolen from him and others receive credit, and even to not see one of his greatest works produced and played or staged during his lifetime, Scott Joplin continued to move on and has continued to make an impact on our world today. Scott Joplin.